Is it possible to break away from generational trauma? And how do we break the cycles of our past? Are we bound to make the same mistakes of our ancestors? Or are we capable of forging a brand new path when we've only known the other path our entire lives? And it's on that path that we ourselves have been shaped. These are the questions that carry us through our story this morning. Because though we read a story about Joseph and his brothers, what we see are generations of pain and even abuse that all come together in this moment. I'm going to ask you to bear with me because the story is going to take a little bit of a ride. And those of you who have heard me before know that we're going to make the pieces all fit together in the end, but it's going to take us a little bit of time to get there. So let's do it. Jacob favors Joseph, a favoritism that manifests so clearly and explicitly, even creating a special cloak for Joseph. And it's important for us to pause and remember that Jacob comes by his favoritism honestly. Both his father and his grandfather have a preference between their children. Abraham favors Ishmael, and Isaac favors Esau. And though God ultimately rejects both of those choices, and the covenant is passed down through Isaac and Jacob, that only adds to our point that God, too, shows a preference between brothers. Joseph's brothers begin to foster a hatred for him. A spark perhaps lit by Jacob's love, but fanned by Joseph himself, who boasts of dreams that demonstrate a future of himself as a leader above all others in his family. And while his father chastises him for it, it falls flat. And immediately before our text from Genesis this morning begins, the text reads, "Vayikanu vo echa va'aviv shamar et hadavar." So his brothers were wrought up with jealousy at him, and his father kept the matter of the dreams in mind. Vayikanu vo echav. His brothers were wrought up with jealousy at him. The text leaves the object of the jealousy and the anger somewhat ambiguous, reading as if the anger at Joseph begins to transfer to their own father as well. And so this sets our scene. The very next verse tells us, "Vayelchu echav lirot et son avihem b'Shechem." One time when his brothers had gone to pasture their father's flock in Shechem. Shechem. Shechem, let's remember, is a city in which Simeon and Levi led a massacre in retribution for the attack against their sister Dinah and in defiance of their father, who was horrified and terrified by their actions. Shechem is a city geographically far from their father's home in Hebron, and the city in which they flexed their muscles literally and figuratively against both the inhabitants of the city and their father Jacob. It's notable that this is where they go, and that they leave Joseph behind. Shechem is the city in which they reject their father's authority, reject the brother whom their father has chosen, and set off to establish themselves independent of Jacob. And Jacob, it seems, sensing this, sends Joseph to find his brothers, desperate to keep a connection, to keep his sons from shifting too far away. We know that when Joseph begins to approach his brothers, they see him from a distance, and their immediate reaction is to conspire to kill him. They have broken ties with their father. They've returned to the scene of their power, a violent power, a deadly power, and now they choose to utilize that power on their brother. And this too, the brothers come by honestly, because this is not the first story that we have in which we find brothers attempting to kill brother. Indeed, our very first story of two brothers in the Bible ends in murder as Cain kills Abel. Ishmael, whom God says will not inherit the covenant, is himself left for dead as Abraham sends off his eldest son into the wilderness with but a little food and water. And Jacob's own brother Esau seeks to kill him after Jacob tricks his father and steals his blessing. These brothers, too, seek to kill Joseph. But then they choose instead to sell him. And if we didn't already know that this story has more to it than meets the eye, the text demands that we look closer in its puzzling account of the narrative, telling us that the brothers see a caravan of Ishmaelites off in the distance and choose to sell him to the Ishmaelites. But then a group of Midianites pass by, and it's the Midianites who pull Joseph out of the pit, who seem to come out of nowhere. The Midianites then sell him to the Ishmaelites, and later we're going to learn that no longer do the Ishmaelites have Joseph, but it's the Midianites who sell Joseph to the Egyptians. Ishmaelites, Midianites, Midianites, why is this narrative so confusing? Fascinatingly, every one of these nations, Ishmaelites, Midianites, Midianites, were descendants of Abraham. Ishmael was the first son of Abraham, kicked out so Isaac could inherit. And later, the Bible tells us that after the death of Sarah, Abraham marries again a woman named Keturah. ותלד לו את זמרן ואת יקשן ואת מדן ואת מידיan ואת ישבק ואת שוח. And Keturah bore to Abraham Zimran and Yakshan and Medan and Midian and Yishbak and Shuach. It would seem as though this story is the climax moment in our play, the scene just before the end of the act in which all the characters suddenly reappear and all the small scenes that we never knew were relevant before suddenly return center stage. And here's where we bring it all together. A story that we might have thought was a story of Joseph and his brothers, it turns out is actually a story of brothers pitted against brothers and fathers against sons. Isaac inheriting everything over all of Abraham's other children, Jacob stealing the brother from Esau, Abraham abandoning Ishmael, Jacob tricking Isaac, Simeon and Levi defying Jacob, and generation after generation of fathers favoring one son over all others leads up to this moment. It's overwhelming when we stop to think about it. And to imagine that this one scene as the product of so many dozens of actions, a story that began long before our main characters were even born. And it feels as though the brothers never had a chance. Their story already written for them. Their destiny already determined. But if singular acts can cause reverberations and pain and trauma far beyond the life of one person, then so too can singular acts cause joy and healing and promise, far bigger and broader and longer than the intention of the original actor. Because while this is a story of generational trauma, it's also a story of small acts in which the characters choose to change their course. It's not interesting in this story that Jacob favors Joseph. And it's not interesting that the brothers conspire to kill Joseph. As we've said, we've seen that all before. Here's what's interesting in this story. It's interesting that Jacob sends Joseph to find his brothers. When Ishmael is sent away, when Jacob flees from Esau, that's the end of their story with their parents, and we never see them speak again. But Jacob doesn't allow his sons to become distant. He sends Joseph far away to keep the connection. He sends him a great distance to check on them. Vayomer lo lech na re'eh et shalom achecha ve'et shalom hatzon v'hashiveni davar. He said to him, go and see how your brothers are and how the flock are faring, and bring me back word. I want to know how they are. And it's interesting in our story that two of his brothers actually tried to save Joseph. Reuben convinces his brothers not to kill Joseph, but to throw him into a pit, arguing that they would keep their hands clean as Joseph would starve to death, but secretly planning to return and later pull Joseph out of the pit. And then Judah, not knowing about Reuben's plans, convinces his brothers to sell Joseph rather than to let him die what he believes would be a long and painful death. And while each of these acts of Jacob and Reuben and Judah might seem small and maybe even insignificant in the bigger picture, those are enough to change the course of history. And in fact, they set the stage for what will ultimately be the rescue of Egypt and the rescue of the family from excruciating famine, and ultimately a reconciliation between father and sons, brother and brother. And unlike the generations that came before them, every one of Jacob's children, all 12 of his sons, remain in the covenant. And they will form the 12 tribes of the nation that's yet to be built. They change their fate. Because though we're built on our past, and we carry those before us in our very DNA, our future is completely up to us. And rather than resign ourselves to who our past has built us to be, we have the power of choice. And we can choose. We choose in every act, significant and insignificant, that ultimately forges a path that we walk. And we can choose to recognize that today, we are not merely products of our past, but today it is we who creates the past that will form our future still to come.